Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to the launch of the South Africa Survey 2023. I'm Nicholas Lorimer and I'm going to be running things today. So, for those of you who don't know, the South Africa Survey is one of the most invaluable research resources that you can find about the complicated and crazy place that is South Africa. The survey has a very long history. It was launched originally in the 1940s and has been released annually ever since. It is a compendium containing all sorts of data about the country's demographic makeup, the state of the economy, education, healthcare, crime and security, breakdown, political parties, control of municipalities, almost any stat that you might want to look at to get it to grips with South Africa is contained within. So we're just going to be talking a little bit about it today, its history, why it's important, some of the information that you can get from it. I'd just like to say that if you are interested in getting a copy, you can go to irr.org.za/IRR-survey-2023. There will be a link to that, I believe, in the comments, where a member of the IRR will contact you once you've given us your details and just confirm the order with you and where to deliver it and all of that. If you have any questions for the panelists today, please type them in the chat. We will have a brief opportunity to get to them towards the end of the show. Just a couple of questions there, so please get your questions in early if you want me to answer them. And I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Institute and our donors, without whom this would not be possible. We are, of course, a non-profit, so your support is what allows us to keep putting out this information about the country, which informs researchers, policymakers, and students. So we're just first going to quickly have a history of the survey, which will be given by Martin van Staden. Then we're going to go through some reasons, some examples of how the survey can be useful to you, some newsworthy stuff that you can get out of the survey. We'll then do the questions and answers, and then we'll close up for the day. So without any further ado, let me introduce Martin van Staden, Deputy Head of Policy Research at the IRR. Martin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick. Good morning, everyone. First off, I'm sorry for being shrouded in darkness, but I'm sure this is a condition that most South Africans are now getting quite used to. I unfortunately do not have a lot of time to unpack a very rich history, but please do join me for a moment by observing the South Africa Survey's history from at least a bird's eye view. Now, for many years, the Institute of Race Relations and the South Africa Survey were quite synonymous in the mind of the South African intelligentsia, as this product was and might still by some be regarded as the Institute's flagship project. The IRR has existed for almost a century now, and the survey for 74 of those years. So it goes without saying that what we have here is representative of a very rich history. The very first, then we might call it unofficial, survey was conducted in 1936 for the year 1935, and it was authored by J.D. Reinald Jones, who was the very first executive director of the IRR. And he wrote this survey under the title, Race Relations in 1935, a South African Survey. Jones wrote in the introduction that, quote, "This survey is an experiment which, if it proves successful, will become a regular feature of the January meeting of the Council of the South African Institute of Race Relations," close quote. How right he was. The first official survey, which set the annual pattern that we're used to today, was published in 1949. This publication was titled A Survey of Race Relations, 1948 to 1949, being the 20th annual report of the South African Institute of Race Relations. It was, in other words, launched as the Survey of Race Relations, a title that it would keep until 1984. That year, South Africa underwent some constitutional changes, and the survey then simply became the Race Relations Survey. This naming, of course, made sense in the context of the name of the institute, but also of the time, the South African context in which it was situated, where race relations was always at the forefront of public discourse. But in 1996, right after the transition to democracy began, the name was changed to what it is today, which is simply the South Africa Survey. Now, the first surveys were quite thin. Here we have a survey from the early 1950s, if you could see that. And you can also see the cover design was quite basic back then. But by the 1970s, there was some color that came to the cover designs, and the surveys were getting quite a bit thicker than what was previously the case. Here in the mid 1980s, you can see the kind of the retro type of abstract style that people are used to when you think about the 1980s, and it's also quite a thick book. It was definitely in the 600 pages. But it was only in the 1990s that the IRR began using photos that it still does today as the cover of the survey. And you can see here, this is the important year 1994, 1995, a very important edition of the Race Relations Survey, also quite a thick book. So I don't have a physical copy of the survey that we're discussing today, but it is a bigger book than even this, and I think it totals about 770 pages, so it's a significant piece of data. What you'll notice is that the later surveys, being the thicker they became, the greater a role data and graphs and tables, etc., began to play. The earlier surveys had significantly more analysis and explanation and interpretation by the Institute staff, whereas later surveys had progressively less and less of that, to the point where the current survey has none of that whatsoever. There are in the current survey only graphs and data, raw data and tables, etc. Of course, much of the IRR's analysis is based on survey data, but the analysis is not incorporated into the survey itself. You'll find our analysis on our website, in other publications of ours, and of course in the mainstream media. Now, with such analysis and data, one imagines that some utility comes about. Well, the survey has been widely used throughout its history. Quite notably at the 1963 Rivonia trial, Nelson Mandela quoted from the survey as he sat accused of terrorism in what became known as the "I am prepared to die" speech. Mandela was particularly interested in the data on the inequality between the state funding of education for white children versus that afforded to black children. He also was very concerned with the differing standards and conditions at black and white schools. In the 1990s, the Cape Argus wrote in an editorial that the survey is without peer as a fact file on South African life. A paper in Frankfurt in Germany described it as a must-read for any foreign South Africa watcher. Business Day described it as a required reference for researchers and legislators. The journalist Brooks Spector more recently wrote in the Daily Maverick that during the height of apartheid, quote, with political actors, activists, or journalists, and that was the South African Institute of Race Relations' publications, most especially its premier annual publication, the Race Relations Survey, close quote. The survey and its historical editions remain quite sought after to get an accurate picture of what happened in South Africa over the preceding 8 or so decades. The Institute was, for instance, recently contacted by someone who was writing a speech about IRR President Ezekiel Mahabane, whose term of presidency was from 1975 to 1977. This person wanted some of the highlights of the Institute from those years. And of course, I consulted the survey. I found that the IRR monitored the Soweto riots of 1976 to 1977 quite closely and reported on them in great detail in the surveys of those years. The surveys show that the IRR appreciated the volatility of the situation and warned the government to de-escalate. The IRR primarily interfaced with the Deputy Minister of Bantu Administration, Andries Treurnig, who would later go on to found the far-right Conservative Party. As Deputy Minister of Bantu Administration, Treurnig dismissed any and all warnings about the developing situation in Soweto. But nonetheless, the IRR monitored and reported in depth on the lead up and the occurrence and the aftermath of the riots well into 1977. The surveys detail how the IRR called on the government to expand the terms of reference of the Celia Commission, which was appointed to investigate these disturbances, quote, suggesting that not only the immediate causes and consequences of these events, but also the general social, political, and educational conditions in the townships which might have contributed to these events should be investigated, and that at least 2 independent persons, one of whom should be black, should be included in the commission, close quote. Mr. Abo Sisingeni Halangwane was subsequently appointed to the commission, and this was a national commission of inquiry in South Africa in the late 1970s, and the IRR managed to have a black individual appointed to that commission. The surveys around that time also report on how the IRR itself was targeted by state repression. In August 1976, Mr. Barney Pityana, a co-founder of the South African Students Organization alongside Steve Biko, and a regional youth program organizer for the IRR in Port Elizabeth, was detained, as was Mr. Govan Reddy in Natal, who was with the Institute for Black Research and also a research assistant at the IRR. In November 1976, Ms. Jeanette Curtis, an archivist at the IRR, was served with a banning order, and she was forced to flee to Botswana in 1977. The surveys also record that in 1977, after Steve Biko's death, that the IRR released a statement, quote, "We mourn the death of Steve Biko. We deplore the law that permitted it, being the Terrorism Act. We consider the minister's explanation inadequate. We demand an immediate inquiry before a judge. Nothing less will satisfy the people of South Africa," close quote. That year, the IRR also issued a statement that 16 people had died in detention since March 1976. It said, quote, "A definite belief prevails amongst relatives and friends of the detainees that these deaths have resulted from the system of persistent interrogation in solitary confinement," close quote. The IRR again called for a commission of inquiry into the conditions of detention in South Africa. In October 1977, a survey reports that 18 organizations were declared unlawful in terms of the Internal Security Act. The IRR called a public protest meeting, which 300 people attended. A resolution was adopted at this meeting that condemned the bannings as, quote, "an act of ruthless tyranny, an act insensate in its stupidity, tragic in its dimensions, and incalculable in the harm it does to the people of this country and the Republic's international relations," close quote. The statement further noted that such action would lead to violent confrontation, which is ultimately what transpired during the 1980s. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I've only touched on 2 years of the history of the survey in the 1970s, and it already created a picture of what happened primarily in South Africa in those years, recording both the Soweto riots in detail and condemning and explaining the death of Steve Biko in detention. And this went on for 76 years, and we still continue to release surveys today. So this was only a taste of what can be found in the historical editions of the Survey of Race Relations and the South Africa Survey. My colleagues will highlight what this year's survey contains, but I am happy later to answer some of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. An absolutely fascinating history. And it's a bit of a shame you couldn't go into more detail, but if you have any questions about that, please do let us know. All right. Thank you, Martin. Next up, we've got project manager at the IRR, Terence Corrigan, as well as Makone Maja, who's an analyst at the CRA. We're going to just talk a little bit about what's in this edition of the survey. So let me just welcome them to the stream there. Welcome very much, guys, and the floor is yours. I don't know which of you is going first.
Well, hello everyone. Some of you may recognize me, Terence Corrigan, and my colleague Makone, who's a up-and-coming rising star. We are going to present a few bits and pieces of information about this year's survey. to both because the information itself is relevant, but also because we want to give you a flavor of what you can actually do with this. Now, the fact that I'm sitting in darkness looking rather gothic, I think speaks to the reality that South Africa is finding itself in. And what Makone and I are going to do is present you with data which is drawn entirely from this edition, which helps to contextualize the national mood, why so many people are despondent, and where the country has come from and where it's going. Can we bring up the slides?
We are bringing them up just shortly.
Okay. The curse of modern technology. Back in the 1990s, I worked on a few editions of this, and it was very much a case of sending messages by fax, typing everything out meticulously by hand. No one had mastered the joys of copy and paste, and we also, incidentally, at that stage did not have individual internet or email access. So what we will be speaking about is information drawn from, first of all, the chapter on employment. There's about 13 chapters which cover things like demographics, if you want to know what the population of the country is, how that's split by age, how that's split by age over province, etc., by gender. That's all there. We have a chapter on the economy, on public finance, employment, industrial relations, figures on strikes, trade union membership, etc., business and infrastructure, a very topical issue, assets and incomes, education, of course, recently in the news, health, social security, living conditions, what sort of proportion of the population are living in poverty, what sort of housing do South Africans have access to, communications, crime and security, and then politics and government. All right, having overcome the initial and inevitable technological foibles, let's dive right in. Let's have a look at the first slide. What we're talking about here, Makone, do you want to move that on? Okay. I'm going to be taking you through some of the data on employment and unemployment. Now, the first piece of information I'd like to show you, if we just go into the next one. Okay, employment trend. Okay, employment trends, the structure of employment in South Africa. This is very, very important for understanding where we've come from. And as I say, the survey doesn't just provide a snapshot; it provides a running commentary. So we present the structure of our information over time, where possible, with international comparisons. How were people employed in 1994, and how are they employed in 2022, which is the time frame that the latest edition deals with? Well, you can see, for instance, that the sort of blue-collar employment, mining, manufacturing, constituted nearly 40% of employment in 1994. Kids were graduating school, and I just flag that idea: kids graduating school. Youth employment, youth unemployment, and they were then moving into into jobs that perhaps gave them some mobility. We're talking about things like factory work, talking about mining. You could learn skills and progress like that. Let's see what's happened to that by 2022. Well, manufacturing is at 11%, something like only a third as large. Mining down to about 4.5. In other words, those blue collar jobs have shrunk to the equivalent of a third of employment. What's grown? Well, we can see trade gone quite significantly, almost doubled from about 14% to 22%. The big winner here, however, has been finance, from about 4% to something like 23%. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that unskilled people are moving into areas of the economy. We're talking about trade, particularly, which do not require, which frequently do not require much much in the way of skills to start, but also have very limited prospects for advancement. Finance is of course very different, but finance assumes a particular level of skill. Let's go on to the next one. Now, this is our unemployment rate, both our official and our expanded. Now, remember that we define official unemployment as people without work, available for work, and wanting to work and looking for work. 1994, that number was that proportion was about 20%. Now we're up into close to 33. Look what happens when we look at the expanded version, though. We go from 31% to 44%. In other words, from about from just under 1 in 3 to just under 1 in 2 people are unemployed. This is catastrophic, and I'll show you just how catastrophic it is when we look at the next slide. Here we rank South Africa alongside a number of peer countries. South Africa's official unemployment at 33.9% is the highest of the countries that we've compared it to, and quite possibly the highest in the world. Nigeria is also faces a dire situation. Botswana, our neighbor, 25%. That a lot of that has to do economy is structured, but perhaps more comparable, Greece, which has seen massive economic trauma, only 12%. Now that's catastrophic, but we outdo that times 3. Brazil, we're talking about 7 or 8%. All this information is there to take a look at. China, about 5%. South Africa is truly a global outlier. These figures should keep us all awake at night. When we go into the next one, we can start to understand this a bit more deeply. Now, what we have here, and this might not be very clear on your screen, but please, if you would like to get hold of the survey, you can have a look at this. These are trends in employment that are somewhat less well remarked on. They are our labor participation and labor absorption rate. In other words, what proportion of the population is actually in the job market and what proportion are being taken up. And here we see something very concerning. From 60.8% to 56.8% labor participation. In other words, fewer South Africans are in the job market, are trying to work. Now, that is concerning, but what is really concerning is this. Labor absorption, the ability of the economy to actually take people on, has gone from 45.8%, which is already quite catastrophic, to 37.8%. In other words, just getting job market, just finding some sort of work is it's the word catastrophe just begins to describe it. And what we see here also, interestingly, in the labor absorption and also the participation, is that when South Africa had its decent economic growth bump in the sort of 2004, 2005, 2006 period, there was an increase, showing that very, very firm link. We do not solve this unless we get growth moving. If we go into the next one. I want to put this into numbers. We often talk rates, but remember that each person unemployed is a person with a household without an income, with people whose lives are not being lived to the fullest. The total number of employed people in 1994 was 7.971 million. In other words, just under 8 million. Now, by the time we get to 2022, that has doubled to about 15.6 million. The economy is bigger, more people are working. But look, what we also present in the survey is a breakdown of employment by age. Now, in the segment between 15 and 24, that's your youth. In 1994, 1.5 million young people were employed. Now, these are actual people, not rates. By 2022, only just over 1 million young people were employed. In other words, there are fewer, in terms of actual numbers, fewer youngsters employed than were employed in 1994. Now, remember, there may be certain reasons for this. There are factors like improved availability of education. But let's look at something else. Unemployment. Here, I want to put these numbers to you. I've just shown you the change in the number of employed, but I want to show you what unemployment looks like in 2002 by the official definition. Nearly 8 million people are unemployed. In other words, without work or looking for work, can't find it. Of these, 1.67 million are young people. In other words, there are something like 500,000 more young people in South Africa who are unemployed than are actually working. If we go into the expanded definition, we have an unemployed cohort of something like 12.3 million. 12.3 million people without work, many of whom have given up. And amongst those young people, we have about 2.7 million. So in other words, for every young person who is employed today, there are almost 3 who are not. That should frighten us. Now, remember I said back at the beginning, just keep in mind the idea of leaving school and finding work. For many South Africans, the harsh reality which the survey captures is that many of these young people face a very real prospect of not finding any work at all. With that, I'm going to hand over to Makone. He's going to take us through some of our data about crime and security.
Thank you very much, Terence, and hello to all the friends of the IRR as well as colleagues in the media. Next slide, please. So moving on to our crime and security chapter, just to paint a picture of the sort of expansive data with which you find in this particular chapter, we go from categories that include crimes against women and children to crimes involving animals. We provide longitudinal statistics and trends that span either from periods including 1994 to today, or on a shorter duration, you will see trends that span on a quarterly basis over the last 4 years. And then from there, you will sort of see the security aspect of the chapter be included, where you see state action taken to punish crime, as well as the state of prisons and correctional services. Now, starting with our first slide, what we want to show you in terms of crime data as it relates to South Africa are 2 trends that you will notice. One is that on the longitudinal range of data, you will sort of see a decline in crime over time. However, what contrasts that is that when you shorten the duration and you compare data from just a period of 5 years, then you start to see crime statistics creep back up. So just on our first slide here, the range of the data spans 28 years between 94 and 2022. Here you're looking at contact crime cases. So that includes murder, attempted murder, aggravated robbery, serious assault, common assault, as well as common robbery. And again, on your y-axis, you see the number of cases in the 100,000s, and on your horizontal axis, you see that time duration. So again, you see in each of these crime categories that crime has significantly declined over the years. And again, we're just looking at the number of cases here. So if you convert the metric and you start looking at rates of crime in South Africa across these categories provided in context of crime cases, you see an even more significant decline in the state of contact crime cases. So again, that's the sort of range you get and trend analysis you get from the data provided in the survey. And this is also reflected, a similar pattern is reflected in property-related crimes. So those would be theft of a motor vehicle, theft out of a motor vehicle, is that on a longer range, crime does seem to be declining. At least that is according to police reports. Next slide, please. In our next slide, we compare crimes across quarters, and in the chapter itself, we tend to look at quarters 2 and 3. As one of our colleagues usually says, that quarters 2 and 3 are most reflective of a normal state of events in South Africa. And so just looking at quarters 3 across the years 2019 to 2002, you see a small decline there in that year, 2020. And again, that is attributable to that huge intervening event that was the global pandemic, COVID-19. But as we move away from lockdowns, you start to see crime creep back up in various of those categories. Not too much, but there certainly does seem to be gradual increases in crime across the year. So these two pieces of data would be reflected in statistics and trends, where you as a subscriber or a reader of the survey can easily come to these conclusions yourself. Next slide, please. And then we move on to the security aspect of the chapter. Here we're looking at the ratio of people per police officer versus people per private security officer. Again, longitudinal range, looking at from the years 1997 on your horizontal axis to 2021. And on the y-axis, you have the number of people per police officer versus people per private security officer. And as you can see from the red bars, where you get a sense of how many police to people ratio we have. You have in the year 2021, something like 463 people per police officer. So that means you have one police officer in South Africa servicing about 460 people, in comparison to a much smaller number that you can see there, people per private security officer, where you have far more people dedicated, more private security officers dedicated to people in South Africa. So that would be 103-to-1 ratio. Just speaking again to the state of security in the country, the state of law enforcement in the country, the capacity of the police to enforce and act on crimes in South Africa. Next slide, please. And on to prison escapes and deaths in police custody. I particularly included this slide because of a particular case that has gripped the attention of South Africans since the beginning of the year. Cases of prison break, as you can see reflected in the data, are not actually very new to South Africa. If anything, we see significant improvements in the number of escapes as well as the number of escapees. So again, this speaks to on your prison escapes and escapees graph, that y-axis speaks to the number of cases, and you can see a significant decline as infrastructure in prisons improves. You do see that, so does the number of prison escapes and escapees. And then right adjacent to it, we have the deaths in police custody. And here we present deaths in police custody as well as deaths as a result of police action. And what would distinguish the two is deaths in police custody would include things like homicide and hangings or suicides, versus deaths as a result of police action. These, as we've seen in the data, are usually if the police acts against somebody heavy-handedly, leading to the death of the person. Again, some of the data was not available, so you can see those sharp declines in the data that reach 0. That would simply be just data not reflected or reported to the police. But you see that where there are certainly peaks in the years where these deaths are significant, but they are average out over the years between, say, 2010 and 2022. And then next, we move on to causative factors for that result in incidents of public violence. This will also be included in the survey itself. And here you're looking at selected factors that result in public violence. There's a lot of discussion in the country recently about different protest action and whether a public protests are on the rise or not. This sort of data gives you an idea of where grievances are for majority of South Africans. And I specifically highlighted that electricity graph so that you can contrast the number of causative factors that resulted in public violence between 2017, which would be the darker graph, versus 2022, specifically for the electricity category would be the red graph. And you can see that those causative factors being electricity as one is certainly on the rise, and we're seeing a lot of reports coming out of the media of definitely people in the suburbs taking to the streets to protest against continued and perpetual load shedding. So again, that is the range of data that you'll find from the survey itself, only giving you a quick snapshot of sort of what you can expect. Thank you.
If I could just sort of sum this all up, what I hope we've demonstrated is the way these things kind of come together. A country with severe security issues is not always a great investment option. Now you will see within our within other chapters we address gross domestic investment, foreign investment, etc. And you can certainly trace and correlate things. That of course then hits on knocks onto the growth rate, and therefore also onto employment and unemployment. We just want to emphasize that the survey is presented without comment. In other words, we give you the facts and nothing but the facts. We are, of course, analysts, and we're very happy to give our interpretations. But the survey is unique in that it is a product unto itself that presents South Africa in its cold, hard numbers.
All right, thank you very much. We will now do a short little question and answer session. So we already have a question in the chat, which I think I will address to Terence, but please feel free to ask any questions about any of the data that you might want to know about from the survey. It covers almost every facet of South African life, so got big scope there to chat about. So this question is, it is astonishing that nominal youth employment numbers have declined since 1994, though total employment numbers have doubled, reflecting population growth. Is this a reflection of the failure of schools to produce employable matriculates? And let me ask Terence maybe if you'd like to answer that one.
Well, that's not something that would be commented on in the survey, but I think that if you look at the state of education, which has been a long-term problem, and the recent international comparisons about reading for meaning, show just how dire that problem is. And if you look at the changing structure of the economy, particularly how that service sector, particularly finance, is growing. Yes, you need those, call them academic skills. I would say something else is that the training and apprenticeship system has been severely curtailed. I remember in the 1990s there was what the Labour Minister called the skills revolution, which was going to be piloted through the SETAs, and well, let's just say that the SETAs have often proven to be suboptimal in delivering the sort of mass skilling that the country needs. So yes, I don't think that there's any question that there is a link between those. Also South Africa has, and you'll find this in the education chapter, the sort of multi-tier education system. Those state schools rank from very good to completely dysfunctional. There's a range of private school options, and where you are able to be educated, it will obviously have a big impact on your ability to participate in the labor market or in further education later.
All right, so I don't see any other questions now, so we'll just give another, I think, 10 seconds or so for anyone to ask any questions they might have. Okay, looks like we don't have anything more. So let me just close up for today by saying thank you very much for everyone for attending. We hope that you found this very interesting. The survey, just to remind you, you can order a copy from irr.org.za/IRR-survey-2023, and then a member of the IRR will be in contact with you to confirm that order. Friends and voting members of the IRR do in fact get a 50% discount on the book. So do take advantage of that if you are a friend or a voting member of the Institute. And I would also just like to remind everyone that every single analyst at the IRR is steeped in the information contained in this book, and we regularly employ it in our analysis of the country. We like to be as data-driven as possible in talking about South Africa and its problems. So if you would like any of us to appear for a media appearance, please don't hesitate to get in contact with us. Also, if you have any further follow-up questions that you'd like to ask one of the panelists here, if you're watching this after the recording has been live, please send an email to info@irr.org.za. And I also just want to thank the friends and donors of the Institute once again for making this possible. I remember using it when I first came in as an intern at the IRR as a junior, and it was an invaluable resource with enormous amounts of information. You really do expand your understanding of the complicated place we live when you take a look at it. All right, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.